Welcome to the Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation.
Good evening, and welcome to the Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation's webinar series. My name is Paul Bracey, and I'm the founder and president of the organization. And I'd like to give you a little background on the organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we were founded in 2020. We're staffed by volunteers. You see some of the volunteers here. Joanne Zidek, who is the event coordinator, who is responsible for putting this evening together, with a lot of support from other folks. I don't want you to think she did it by herself. And our Chief Operating Officer, Randy Wilding, will be handling the webinar and questions for the presenter. And Stephanie Durkerout will be behind the scenes with Randy, forming the questions and presenting them. And Bob, I will be introducing more later, but we should also, you can see Bob Staines there. One thing that I think we should know, we're all volunteers. There's a few other people that are part of our team, Peter Raymond and Michelle Easton, who also participated in creating this evening. How we are funded, we're funded by donations. We receive donations from people like you. Obviously, to present our programs, which are all free, we do have a cost. So we appreciate the donations. And we've been fortunate to be able to do this since 2020. And let me talk a little bit about this evening and the importance of, excuse me, the presentation this evening. The social divide in the United States today poses a threat to our Constitution, democracy, and institutions. This divide also hampers human reconciliations, which is the goal of the Doc C. Bracey Center. We risk living under a dictatorship if we fail to bridge these divisions. This issue transcends politics. It concerns the kind of country we are and want to be. Those who believe in America's promise, as stated in the preamble to the Constitution, and I quote, form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for a common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. We must rise to this challenge. Each of us must contribute to the solution by using our voices to bridge the divides and fulfill the promise. And we can do this, even though it looks pretty dangerous today. If we make a commitment to make our voice heard, we can do this. Tonight's presenter, Bob Staines, is a longtime friend and colleague. He will help us address this challenge with his presentation, Depolarize, Dialogue Skills for Transcending Divide. Bob is the founder of Bob Staines and Associates Conflict Transformation, where he aims to foster curiosity and humanity among people. He is also a senior associate at Essential Partners and has extensive experience facilitating dialogues across the United States and internationally. His background as a family therapist, his practice of meditation, and his understanding of interpersonal neurobiology equips him to cultivate understanding and connection within fractured communities. I am more than honored to be able to welcome Bob this evening. Good evening, Bob.
Hey, Paul, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, to be with the Doc C. Bracey Center, and to be with you all. I hope to share a little bit with you some insights that I've picked up along the way of doing dialogue work, particularly across identity issues around the US and other countries for many, many years. So I'll be talking with you about that work, about some understanding that comes from that, how we get into polarization and what we can do to get out of it in our relationships. So let me share my screen now. I'm going to walk through some slides with you. And we'll try to take it from there. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So, depolarize, dialogue skills for transcending divides. Um, well, let's get started here. There's no shortage of things around which we can polarize in our world today. There are a lot of issues that are pulling at us. They're pulling at us inside and they're pulling at us in our relationships and pulling us apart. Immigration is one, abortion, race, sexual orientation, many issues that we're involved in both globally and in our own families can set us up to experience division and polarization. And often what happens when we start talking about these issues is fire. We get burned. We have a conversation that flames up and it hurts us. And often what happens is it goes underground. I work a lot with organizations and groups, and there are these fiery conversations, and then everything goes underground and influences things, sometimes for years at a time. And what we hope to do with the skills of depolarizing is to melt that ice and create a space where people can have the kind of fire that gives enough warmth to kindle relationship and enough light to see each other without burning the house down. Key to this, of all of this, of what I'm going to say, at the core of everything is the ability to listen. So I want to start with a poem because I think that this author, John Fox, describes well what happens when people experience being deeply listened to. And I can tell you, I've worked with people across the country and 10 other countries. When they experience being deeply listened to by someone that is surprising to them, they may have never been listened to by an opponent before. It's transformative. So let's look at this poem. When someone deeply listens to you. When someone deeply listens to you, it is like holding out a dented cup that you've had since childhood and watching it fill up with cold, fresh water. When it balances on top of the brim, you are understood. When it overflows and touches your skin, you are loved. When someone deeply listens to you, the room where you stay starts a new life, and the place where you wrote your first poem begins to glow in your mind. It is as if gold has been discovered. When someone deeply listens to you, your bare feet are on the earth, and a beloved land that seemed distant is now at home within you. Let me ask you to take a minute and just reflect a bit on a time when you were deeply listened to. Think of a situation and a person who really took you in and listened to you. And just think for a minute about what the effects were at that time. What was the effect of that listening on you? Just pause for a second, take that in, hold it, and then we'll try to hold that for the rest of our time together. Okay. So here's what we're going to do tonight. Um, One of the big questions that I've gotten over the years is, so conversation, who cares? We're going to talk about why conversations matter, why we should be paying attention to conversation, um, and where and why we get stuck in those conversations. And I'll talk a little bit about interpersonal neurobiology, our response to perceived threat, and the effect that that has on communication, and what that sets up in terms of patterns of conversation. And then we'll talk about what helps. We have some what I'm calling dramatic enactments, which is essentially a fancy word for role plays of people showing us what to avoid and what to do. And we'll be talking about engaging and responding to an identity quake. That is what happens when somebody does something that you feel is hurting your identity in some way. How can you engage rather than react? We'll talk about the power of questions to create or weaken connections and the importance of being curious, genuinely curious, and listening expansively for the complexity of another. And then how can we speak for ourselves genuinely in the midst of a conflict when we may feel activated by what other people are saying? So that's how things will go tonight. As promised, we'll start out with talking about why conversations matter. Now, think about this. We all live in communities, whether that community is the community of our family, our place of worship, our civic organization, our city, our country. We're in community with each other. And those communities are driven and made up by relationships. And those relationships are created through conversations. If the conversations are bad, dysfunctional, the relationships are going to tend to be bad and dysfunctional. And then the communities, what the community can accomplish, if it's resting on relationships that are problematic, that rest on communications that are problematic, the community suffers. So attending to conversation is a high leverage initiative to help shift the ways communities can function together. The great Martin Buber talked about the importance of conversation extensively in his book I and Thou, and relating to each other in a different way. And one of the quotes that I love from his book is, all real living is meeting. That is, meeting each other. All real living is meeting. But there are challenges to that real meeting, right? And that's why we have dysfunctional conversations and polarization. I want to talk a little bit about this. Rick Hanson wrote a wonderful book called Hardwiring Happiness. Rick Hanson's a neurological communication researcher and talks about how the brain is structured and set up. And I love him because he talks about it in a way that a guy like me can understand. And he says the brain is Velcro for the bad and Teflon for the good. We're sort of hardwired to be Velcro for the bad and Teflon for the good. And what he means is that we pay attention to negative stuff in our world for survival. That's how we survived, in cave person days, be attending to the evidence of danger. So we see that, we hang on to that. And the good stuff kind of tends to fall off. When I was a marriage therapist, people would come in for therapy. You would have thought that they never had a good time together because all they could remember was the bad. Velcro for the bad, Teflon for the good. And there are powers that can manipulate that and have us live in fear, have us live in anxiety, because that's what sticks. So what we try to do when we're thinking about creating dialogue, whether it's between two people or in a group, is we want to challenge our negativity bias. We want to see if we can help people, instead of having a negative sense of the other and automatically reacting to that sense, to shift into a more expansive way of engaging, seeing each other, and more expansive way of using skill to engage one another. Two questions I want to open with, and I'm going to close with them too, that I'd like you to keep in mind. Communication theory teaches us that every communication arrangement encourages some things and discourages others. Everything we do when we're talking back and forth or we're designing a conversation encourages some things and discourages others. So whenever people are thinking about a conversation that they want to have about something difficult, the two questions that I raise for them to hold on to is, what is it that you want to discourage or prevent that's happened before that's gotten in your way? And what do you want to invite or promote or bring in from the past that's been good for you? So what do you want to prevent? What do you want to promote? Keep those questions with you as you think about your challenging conversations. One way to get there, and I mentioned earlier the importance of listening. Another one of my favorite people is Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman gave a speech a long time ago in 1980 at Spelman College, which many people know as the Sound of the Genuine speech. And I was with an organization for 22 years called the Public Conversations Project. And our founder, Laura, founded that organization for dialogue, partially on the basis of the teaching of Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman says this: I'm secure because I hear the sound of the genuine in myself, and having learned to listen to that, I can become quiet enough, still enough, to hear the sound of the genuine in you. Now, if I hear the sound of the genuine in me, and if you hear the sound of the genuine in you, it is possible for me to go down in me and come up in you. So that when I look at myself through your eyes, having made that pilgrimage, I can see in me what you see in me, and the wall that separates and divides will disappear, and we will become one because the sound of the genuine makes the same music. So, a lot of what we're about when we're talking about creating constructive conversation is creating a space where people can experience the sound of the genuine in themselves, can speak it, and be open to the sound of the genuine in one another. And one way to think about how to do that, there are so many ways and so many books that have been written about this. When I boil it down, um, I think about three um, sort of pods um, of skill to shift conversations and transform them. The first is to reflect and recognize. And I'm going to go through this in a second of actually what that means. RUA, reflect and recognize, understand, and act. What does that mean? Reflect and recognize is to be able to step back, develop that self-understanding of your own reactions. What am I tempted to be sort of emotionally hijacked by? What are my characteristic responses when I get in the room with somebody that I feel threatened by in some way? And then can I recognize what's happening with the other person as well? That's the first step. And then understanding where those reactions come from. In the moment, can I develop an understanding that I feel wounded and there's a protector or a defender coming up here that I want to put out there with that person? Um, and can I understand how my context, where I come from, my history, my identity, condition the responses that I make? Reflect, recognize, understand, and then act. Can I respond intentionally and not reactively? Parker Palmer talks about when the going gets rough, turn to wonder, get curious. Key skill. Can I get curious when I feel in that tight spot, challenged? Can I get curious about what's happening within myself and others? Can I express that curiosity through listening expansively, through asking artful questions, and also check out my assumptions that I'm bringing with me into the conversation? And then to be able to speak my truth, to report what I see has gone on in a particular situation, a conversation that I'm having, um, check out whether that other person sees the same thing, tell about what that means for me, and then if I need to, request an alternative. Um, so RUA, we'll come back to this a couple times a little bit later on. And now I'd like to do another just a little pause and thinking a task for you. And it goes like this. If you just stop and think for a minute about a time when you experienced some threat to an aspect of yourself that is central to who you are. And this is like in conversation. If you hear somebody says something to you that you just feel like, oh, that kind of an experience. And think for a minute about how that affected how you felt in your body, your thoughts or feelings about yourself, about the other person, and then what you either said or didn't say, what you put forward and held back in that moment. But just take a minute, just pause for maybe 15 or 20 seconds and have you think about that. You might want to take a couple of notes for yourself um, about your experience of that. And we'll see how that, we'll come back to that a little bit later on. Okay. By the way, you will receive all these slides if you want them in PDF form. So if you want to go back to this as a reflective exercise, you'll have a chance to do that later. Well, now let's get to that threat, which often starts with something like this. Somebody says something that just sets you off. Well, I'll just say, sets me off. Like a guy like this engaging me that way is going to set me off, and I'm going to feel threatened in some way. And when that happens, uh, I often feel very vulnerable. For many years, I trained mediators. And one of the exercises I did with mediators was to imagine that they were going to go home and there was going to be a conflict waiting for them with a significant other. And what animal did they feel like in that moment? And they would always draw pictures of animals like lambs or mice or things like that. And I did it for many, many years. And then also asking them to draw a picture of the person waiting for them. And they would come out like this. And the experience is that when we get into a situation of conflict and we perceive threat from another person, we often feel like they are predator and we are prey. Well, why is it important? It's important because when that happens, we tend to get vigilant. Remember going back to the Velcro for the bad. We scan for signs of danger, for evidence that we need to be cautious, we need to be aware, we need to take care of ourselves. And in the process, we develop tunnel vision. We focus in on the negative. We may miss the positive. We miss the complexity of the other. We lose touch with our own capacity to engage in a situation. And we have a very thin focus that can really get us in trouble when more is needed in a situation. Some of the effects of that perceived threat. I like to say when threat comes in the door, curiosity goes out the window. We're focused. We are not going to be curious about everything else. We're going to be paying attention to that potentially negative stimulus that we need to be aware of. So we miss a lot. Then we get our perception becomes very narrow. Our access to our own internal resources is narrowed, and our sense of choice goes down, and we feel pushed around by the other person or by the dynamic. We often create very thin stories of them. They are doing this to us. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And of course, we're usually the virtuous ones, and they're the evil ones, whether it's a person or a group. And a process ensues of vigilance, attack, and avoidance that then can become a repetitive pattern. And here's what it looks like. Let's start up here with activation in the upper right-hand corner, where somebody says something. Let's say I'm talking with somebody, and somebody says something that activates some sense of threat in me, and that upsets me. And I may feel like I need to be on my guard. And when I'm on my guard, I start to get vigilant for evidence that this person is of danger to me. And I may preemptively attack, or I may say something that's going to defend myself, which generally sets that other person off who goes through the same process, and then in turn gets me going. And we have a stuck cycle of communication. And I've seen this start with two people in an organization that are activating each other, and then it spreads through the whole organization if it's not attended to. So we want to think about understanding that cycle and how we can interrupt it. And what I'm going to tell you about today are a few ways that you can interrupt that cycle. Well, here's our first dramatic enactment. Let's take a look at when someone has experienced what Stone, Patton, and Sheen in Difficult Conversations call an identity quake. They talk about how that is the toughest thing to engage when we're in conversation and when we feel that somebody has said something that negatively describes our identity. And take a look at this little vignette, and then we'll move on.
So, Bertha, I know my family and I did one of those 23andMe's, and the results are really interesting, but I guess it might have landed differently for my family as a white family. I'm curious, as a Black woman, how would you describe your experience with 23andMe and DNA testing?
It is not my job to educate you about that issue from the perspective of a Black woman. I'm tired. I can't do it.
I thought we came here to have a conversation. I thought this was a dialogue, right? I mean, I was going to tell you about my experience, and you were going to tell me about your experience. And what did I say wrong?
Then tell me about your experience. I mean, I thought that's what we were doing. You would tell me your story, I would tell you my story. I didn't think it was my job to tell you about how Black people feel about this issue.
I just want to understand better, and I don't understand how I'm supposed to learn in this conversation if I can't ask questions to people who've lived a life that's different than mine, right? Like, I can't just figure that out on my own, can I? I mean, how am I supposed to learn if I don't go into spaces and ask questions?
YouTube and James Baldwin. Just read. Take responsibility for educating yourself.
we live in a society, Bertha. We're here together. Like, aren't you?
Oh, now you're going to educate me. See how, oh, that was brilliant. How you just, I think I smell my coffee burning. Let me,
I'm gonna. Okay. So we have one example of a conversation that starts, and you can see a cycle beginning to go there in a negative direction. And we're going to return to that in a little bit. By the way, these role plays that you're going to see, we got a group of practitioners together and talked about what are some of the things that tend to come up in the dialogue work that we do. And the practitioners in the role plays chose what they wanted to put forward and work on. So that's the story there. Well, so what's underneath some of these difficulties that we have? In addition to the neurophysiological stuff of being stimulated, activated, and having a vigilant response, one way of thinking about the process that we go through to get to the encounter that we have with each other when things are difficult is to use the ladder of inference. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. It's been used for many years, created by Chris Argyris back in, I think, the 1980s, to explain how people make sense of the world around them. And I think it's very helpful when thinking about engaging each other, especially engaging what we perceive to be different others. That means different in maybe race, gender, age, whatever. And it goes like this. You see at the bottom of the ladder, there's a blue pool that they call available data. And I like to think about it as all the points of experience, if we're in a given situation, that are available to us that we could pay attention to. But because we're human beings, we can't pay attention to everything. We have to, in some way, decide what we attend to and what we don't attend to in a given situation. So we select aspects of a situation that present themselves to us, and we start to interpret what that selection of data means. What does it mean in this particular situation, what I'm seeing? And we start to create a story about the situation and the people that we're in, that we're with. And we start to draw conclusions about those folks and about the situation. And those conclusions that we draw drive the action that we take when we go back down and engage the people that we're engaging and reinforce the conclusions. We see what reinforces the conclusions that we've already made. And it becomes a self-fulfilling loop. Now, part of the problem is that we don't examine where that process is influenced or how that process is influenced by what we're bringing in, which is represented by the left side of that ladder. So we're all bringing stuff into this enterprise. It says context, assumptions, and values. I would add identity, where we come from. I like to joke, I'm from Buffalo. People think that doesn't really matter, but I'm telling you, it does. It matters what I pay attention to and the meaning I make of things. You lose 4 Super Bowls in a row, it drives you to have a lot of that Velcro. So what we're bringing in terms of our race, our age, our gender, our experience, all that affects what I see and what I'm blind to, what I hear and what I'm deaf to, and what I make of the things that I do see and that I do hear. The meaning that I make and the stories I create and the conclusions that I come to are all driven by what's on that left side. So what we want to do in conversation is we want to bring people down the ladder of inference, closer to the pool of experience with each other, make more visible that left side of the ladder to ourselves and the reflective process, and to others, so that we can see a fuller range of the things that are driving people in conversation. Sometimes when I'm working with a group, I'm doing dialogue with people that are highly polarized, I just start out by having them raise their hand and look through their hand at the other, and use that as a way to help them think about everything. The story that I have of you, the story that we have of another, is filtered and framed by what I'm bringing with me. And I'm seeing things in a particular way, shaped by my own background and my own identity. And I'm also only showing a part of myself that's forward facing, and you're not seeing this. And so what I want to do in dialogue is to have a more complete view than what's blocked by my hand, and also to be able to show you what's behind the public face that I'm presenting. When we're in these situations, as I mentioned earlier, we tend to create simple stories. Bob Keegan at Harvard Grad School of Education has written a lot of books talking about how randomness, complexity, and ambiguity can be really unsettling to most people. And in a way, in an effort to cope with that, because we are order-seeking, pattern-seeking people, or have pattern-seeking brains, we complete incomplete circles by creating stories. And those stories, especially when we're experiencing threat, are created quickly, they're shorthand, and they often resort to labels, caricatures, and stereotypes. And when they circulate over and over again, they start to drive relationships and create real problems. If you want to look at a very powerful example of this, check out The Danger of a Single Story on TED. There'll be a link when you get your PowerPoint. So we create simple stories. And simple stories are thin stories. They're of necessity very thin and narrow because they come out of a reaction, shorthand thinking. They tend to be self-confirming. That's how they are. And they don't take into account the complexity of an individual, the context that they're in now and where they came from, what their experience is. They don't account for the context of who's making the story, who's sharing the story, who's passing it along. All these things are characteristics of a thin story. So what we're trying to do in constructive conversation, interpersonally and in dialogue, is to help people be able to speak and hear more complex stories of the other and get away from the recirculation of thin stories. So in addition to thin stories, there are a lot of things that tend to keep the pot boiling. You saw that illustration of the ladder of inference, and listening and speaking from the top of the ladder, from conclusion to conclusion, rather than going down and talking about experience, tends to keep the pot boiling of negativity. Excuse me, I just talked about stories of them, so I don't have to say more about that. But when we have unchecked assumptions, and we are certain that our assumptions are correct, so we don't bother, we don't have to check them out because we know. And we have judgment about that. Well, that really keeps the pot boiling. And then listening and speaking to win rather than to understand, and using questions to unmask, to shame, to instruct. All of these things come up over and over and over again in the cyclical, dysfunctional conversations that characterize polarization. There we go. There's an illustration of people speaking from the tops of their respective ladders of inference. When this process takes root in families and groups, it can become very pernicious, very difficult to deviate from. This diagram was created by Maggie Herzig, one of the founders of Public Conversations many years ago, based on decades of work that she had done with people in different parts of the world. And it's a way of helping us understand how the process of polarization gets started and what the effects are. And it's fairly simple. At the bottom, you'll see people, you can't see this on this rendering, but when this was originally created, those people on the bottom are all multiple colors. And representing how when we live in community, we can interact with various ways of complexity, belief, affiliation, etc. And in our normal environment, we're doing that. But when threat comes into the situation, maybe it's a family where somebody voted differently than the other people. Maybe it's a moral or religious issue that comes in that starts to feel like it's a threat to the integrity of the family. Or maybe in a community, it's somebody wants to start a charter school and some people are for it and some people are against it. Some people feel threatened. When that happens, people gather in interest groups to support each other who have a particular perspective, even on a small level. I've been in boards of elders meetings in church where a dispute comes up between two people. And it's not actually dealt with in the session, but in the parking lot, you have the two groups of people that are talking, and pretty soon the whole church is divided. Because what starts to happen is that people within those groups start to minimize the differences among them. And if people sort of depart from that, if they want to have, say, conversations with the enemy, them, they're brought back into line because it's important that they minimize the differences within themselves and have a more orthodox or cohesive approach and maximize the differences between them and us. The more that goes on, you'll see that more things happen that are destructive and that keep things going in a negative way. People speak in terms of slogans, stereotyping, blaming, thin stories all. When something is said by one side, immediately the other side says it's a lie, you can't trust them. And ultimately, there's an inattention to what this costs because people get blinded to the system that they're in. And there's a despair of being able to do anything to change. Situations that I've gotten involved with over the years, communities are at the top of that inverted pyramid. And we know that if we can invite people back down to that bottom level where they're having a more complex encounter with each other, we can start to reverse this process of polarization. Before we do that, there are a few premises that I've developed over the years of doing this work that I've observed in this country and other countries when people come into conversation about challenging issues. The first is most people really do want to be known. They crave it. They want to be known. They want that sound of the genuine to be asked for, and they want to be able to say it and have it received. Most people don't want to be reduced to a stereotype or a caricature. Most people resist being worked on. That is, some well-meaning person is going to come in and try to change their mind or seduce them in some way to think differently. Most people will resist that in some way or another. And many people are surprised by genuine curiosity, especially when it comes from somebody that they don't expect. If they're locked in a conflict with somebody and that person steps back and says, well, I really am interested in knowing about X. They're pleased, they're surprised, and it shifts the way they engage in the conversation and the people. So in order to break the conflict cycle, what I encourage people to do is to think about moving from an automatic response where you're just triggered and you're responding to an intentional response where you're really thinking about how it is you're going to engage. And there are 3 sets of skills that help with that: reflective skills, receptive skills, and expressive skills. And reflective skills, basically is what I talked about earlier, being able to step back and think and consider and understand what's going on for yourself. Receptive skills involve listening to connect. And there are things to avoid and things to do. Avoid narrow listening. So you're going back to that tunnel vision where you're only listening for one thing. Avoid listening to uncover weakness or listening to win. Avoid only listening for or inviting the landscape of action. We're a problem-solving nation here, generally speaking, and we tend to listen for problems that we can solve and therefore ask for action. And what can you do? You can listen expansively for complexity. We're going to have an illustration of that in a little bit. Listen actively to let people know that you're staying connected. Listen with the purpose of understanding rather than winning. And then listen for and invite the landscape of meaning in addition to the landscape of action. Let's take a look at what that looks like.
Thank you all for agreeing to have lunch with me. I am so frustrated, so angry at myself. I've been talking about this huge project that we're working on, and I turned in a budget that I was very proud of. I thought I checked all the boxes, and I screwed up major. I left out a huge piece in terms of putting that in the contract. So we're going to do about $5,000 worth of work, and it's not included. And I just feel stupid and inept. I thought this was my opportunity to really shine, and my colleagues are really upset with me, and I don't know what to do.
Is it too late to fix it? Is it like the deadline's already passed and you can't make any changes now at this point?
No, that ship has sailed, and I just.
What was the 5,000 for?
For interviews, which is so critical. So we can't say, well, we won't do it. It won't come together without the interviews. So
what about this is so
frustrating. I hear that you're feeling just very frustrated. And what about this is really hitting that point?
You know, every once in a while, people come by and, are you going to retire? When are you going to retire? If I were you, I would retire. And no, I've got all this energy and fire in me, and the work is so important. And then I do this, and and it makes me wonder if I'm the right person for the job.
What did your team say?
Well, most of them say, well, it can happen, but a couple of the younger, brasher folk are saying, giving me the side out, like, we'll help you pack the office up. And yeah.
It sounds like it really hit something that feels big for you right now.
It really does. I still feel like I have a lot to offer. And it's wonderful to be young and shiny, but I still have something to offer. And I kind of feel like I represent something larger than me. And then I screw it up. And yeah.
Well, you haven't probably screwed up before. This is probably just the first time this has happened, right?
You're right. Yeah, I have screwed up before. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Oh, you said you have. Yeah, no, I meant the other way.
Hasn't.
No. I meant the other way, Camila. I meant that this is probably like the first big mistake that you've made, and yeah, no, I meant the other way. I'm curious, what would you have those younger folks know about your experience that maybe they don't understand?
That if you are a leader, if you're courageous, sometimes you screw up. And if we pull together as a team, that we can probably figure some things out. I'm certain they have some knowledge that I'm not aware of. And if we didn't split off and take sides, then we could be okay, maybe. But the issues are so huge now. We need to pull together.
Okay. So there you have an example of somebody who's pursuing the landscape of action, what happened, who said what to whom, very external, and somebody who is inviting the sound of the genuine, inviting Camilla to talk about her feelings, her responses, her hopes. And it's a good illustration of the different ways of following a conversation, and one way leaves people feeling engaged and the other doesn't, not so much. So let's move on to expressive skills. Speaking to be understood, not to defend or win when challenged. So remember that circle we saw earlier. When activated and vigilant, the tendency is to defend or attack. So what can we do that's different from that? Well, the first thing we can do is to inform the person of what we see in the situation and the impact. Here's what I heard you say. Here's how it affected me. To sort of bear witness to that observation and experience, and then invite the perspective of the other person. Did I hear that correctly? Did you have that intention of the impact that it had on me? And then requesting alternative behavior. It would be better for me next time if you blank, and offering help. Is there something that I can do or stop doing that will help? We're going to see an illustration of how to engage that identity quake a little differently. They don't go through these exact steps, but you'll see some of the glimmers of that in a moment. But this is one way to think about how you can manage a challenging situation in a bit of a different way. Let's take a look.
I'm really glad that we had this chance to talk about DNA testing. When my family first saw 23andMe, came on the scene, and we got ourselves some of those DNA tests, we were really surprised by the results. We didn't know we had, roots in Ireland, and, there was the Scandinavian ancestry. And then we were really surprised to see even roots in North Africa. And that really sort of challenged the way we thought about ourselves as yeah, as white people in America, you know? And so I was just curious because I know the experience hasn't been the same for everybody. And Bertha, as a Black woman, I'm just kind of curious, where are Black people at on DNA testing and 23andMe? Yeah, what do you think?
I think that I am not authorized to speak for all Black people, which is not what you said, but I think that that's important to acknowledge that. I think it has raised some real issues in all communities that are interested in finding out where we come from, what our connections are, and how this information can be used for good and maybe sometimes for not so good. So I like to share with you my experience talking to my family about where we came from because we were amazed. I mean, Polynesian islands. I'm like, what is this? So the idea that we can have this conversation and learn more about each other and to really focus on the surprise and what we don't know, I think presents a wonderful opportunity for us to connect with each other and get to know each other and continue our work in talking across differences. So thank you for asking that. I appreciate that.
I do appreciate now when I'm thinking about it that I kind of stepped in a little bit asking about where Black people are at. And that was a little presumptuous, obviously. So thanks for having some grace with me right there and sharing about your experience, Bertha. Now that I'm thinking about it, I realize, I mean, everyone's going to be in a different place and have a different experience just as a person.
Well, I think as we go through this process and have these conversations, I can see me knee deep in stuff too and wishing I could take that back. So I think it is important that we separate intent from impact, but also realize that sometimes the intention may not be as negative as we viscerally feel about it when it's first said. So yeah, I'd love to tell you about it. Some amazing stuff that's come up has got me really interested in.
Okay. So you see the difference between the first round and the second round of the lack of automatic responding to a sense of activation. And as Evan said, giving some grace and how that changes the conversation.
I'm really glad.
Let's move on to the second aspect of receptive skills, which is asking. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the shaping power of questions. We'll have a couple more examples, and then we'll wrap it up for tonight. Questions are incredibly powerful in driving conversation. They shape a lot of things. They can really shape the relationship between the asker and the asked. Just think about when somebody's asked you sort of an off question and it starts to you start to think about them in a particular way. Or somebody asks you a real opening question, you sort of feel warm toward them. So it can really drive the relationship between the asker and the asked, and the feelings about yourself and the asker that come up, especially in the sense of in conflict when questions are asked. It can shape how people make meaning of events, how they interpret events, and then also in those events and conversations, hearing a question will often help people make decisions about what they choose to say or don't say in a given situation. Because part of what they're imagining, especially if there's other people around, is, well, what are the effects of my answers going to be in this situation on the other people that are listening? Questions can invite people to imagine a future that's different from the past that they may be mired in. Can help them have a better sense of their own agency and capacity. Remember the beginning of predator and prey? Questions can help people get out of that dilemma. And then questions can give people the experience of being witnessed. And when I see people asking each other good questions in dialogue, I watch the person who's being asked the question open up and flower because they experience the sense of being witnessed and being interested in. So powerful things, questions. And we can ask questions in a way that shuts things down and doesn't really go anywhere, or we can ask questions in a way that opens things up. And we're going to see an example of the first kind right now.
2, 1. So Frank, I honestly feel that cigarette smoke is the best smell in the entire world. And if it has like a little tinge of gasoline mixed in there with it, even better. It's my favorite.
Are you in the habit of exposing yourself to cigarette smoke and gasoline?
Well, I mean, I'm not lighting up at the gas station, but if somebody was smoking in front of me or on the sidewalk or something, I would try to sniff it and smell it.
Simone, I like you, and we've spent a lot of time together. But like this, honestly, does this not worry you? I mean, like you're seeking out things I think that are demonstrably unhealthy. Aren't you a little worried about that?
I mean, it's not like I'm doing it 24/7. I'm not like out there trying to mix gasoline and cigarettes together and doing something dangerous. I'm just saying, like, when I smell that, I love that smell. It makes me happy.
Um, it's just hard to imagine those. Like for me, those things are like they're not just bad smells; they're like things that make me feel bad. So I'm just like, does your body feel good when you smell those things?
Well, I mean, it brings a smile to my face, so I guess yes. But why are you being so judgmental? I'm just like telling you a smell that I don't know makes me happy.
I guess it's just clearly we're in very different places on this, but
Frank, you serious right now? You're getting upset because I'm telling you about a smell that I like? A bit dramatic. 2, 1.
So, an example of asking questions in a way that's going to shut the person down, and you can see at the end there, it's starting to have an effect on the relationship between them.
2, 1.
Oops. So for yourself, think about the ways the questions have affected you and affect you. Your body. You can be asked a question and you can kind of go, oh, or you can open up and you can feel it, right? You can feel it in your body. It can drive what you think of the other person. What do they think of me? You know, what kind of a person would ask me a question like that? And then the consequent response to that other person. So questions can affect those things as well. And the question that if I'm asking a question, think about the ways that that person receiving that question is going to think of me. And then think about how ready you were to listen to a question, given the context, given the person that posed it, and the choices you make about what to say and hold back. Think about the ways that questions affect the rhythm, the content, and patterns of exchanges. Whether it's a destructive cycle or a constructive cycle that is constellated by a question. If you ever want to see evidence of a destructive cycle, go to any town hall meeting about a controversial issue and watch the way questions are used to create and perpetuate a destructive cycle of communication and polarization. So let's take another look at that engagement and see about what happens when it's done in a bit of a different way.
When you think about gasoline and cigarette smoke, what are some like memories that come to mind for you?
That's a really good question. A couple of different things. I guess if I think about just like cigarette smoke in general, it reminds me of when I lived overseas. I lived in Europe, and people were smoking all the time, which is not something that I would be doing myself, but it reminds me of being in that kind of environment again, because obviously the US does not have that same kind of I don't know, extensive smoking habits that are happening there. But really the smoke and the gasoline part is something unique that reminds me of my grandfather. He was an auto mechanic. He used to be smoking all the time, which was not good for his health in the long run. Don't get me wrong about that. But anytime I smell cigarette smoke and I smell gasoline, I think of us together. He would come home after work. I would be in his house like almost every single day. And he would come home after work. He'd have like suspenders on and which I thought were super cool. And I would sit on the hamper and he would be washing up after work. So like getting all the grime of being a mechanic and all the smells and all that kind of stuff. And that's when we would just spend time together. And he passed away when I was 10. So I don't have like a long lifetime of memories with him. So when I smell that smoke, I'm like, oh, I'm back again, you know, and we're hanging out, buddies again. You know, he would be shaving in the mirror and I would pretend to be shaving with a comb and shaving cream on top of the hamper, you know, as he's cleaning up after work. So those are the things I think about, not just that I like the smell of cigarette smoke. Which
And
I
what
get.
kind of feelings come up for you when you smell those smells and harken back to those memories?
Just nostalgic, you know, just like of a happier time, even though, you know, his health was horrible from the smoking in the end. Just a happier, more innocent time in life, I guess, that I can't get back. And that is when I smell it, it's like I'm right back there on the hamper, pretending to shave with my grandfather.
Yeah. Thanks, Simone.
Thanks for
So, a different way of engaging that same issue with obviously a very different response. And this is a great illustration of a phrase that's used by Essential Partners and before that Public Conversations Project. Behind every belief and perspective is a person, and behind every person is a story. And we know from a lot of research that change comes when we can get to the story, when we can surface the story and have people be witnessed in the story. And it's a really great example of doing that in this line of questioning and the way that that starts to shape and change the relationship.
Uh,
So some general guidelines for questions that can transform conversations. Um, as I just said, keep it personal. Ask about experience, relationships, feelings, etc. You saw that illustrated in the first with Pooja asking some great questions about um, Camilla's feeling as well as her hopes, in addition to the experience that she was having in the workplace. Um, Questions that go with something that's fundamental to the person, the core, the heart, the passion that they carry, especially when you're talking about beliefs and politics and things like that. Questions that are honest, not rhetorical, not statements in disguise, have it coming from genuine interest and curiosity. When you can reflect what someone has said, letting them know that they've been heard before asking for more. A lot of times in the dialogue work, I see people asking each other questions and they precede it by saying, John, you said that the time you went hunting with your father when you were a boy was really meaningful to you. Could you say more about what was it that was so meaningful? So John knows that he's been heard when they do it that way. Questions that are genuine, that are not sort of um, proxy for some other action to lead or instruct or convert, etc. And questions that are open, avoiding yes, no. And I want to thank my colleague and friend John Saruf at Essential Partners who helped me work on this list a little bit. And when you get stuck, as I say, you're going to have this list. It might be helpful for you to think about this. Here are all the things that you can ask in a situation where you feel activated, you don't know what to do, you don't know how to talk to this person that's on maybe the other side of a political divide or whatever. Well, here are a lot of things that you can ask about. Ask about the values that inform their perspective. Ask about the experiences that they've had that help form their perspective. Pursue the line of what's not broken, like Thich Nhat Hanh said. Um, what have they done in the past that's worked? Or in what way do they still value the relationships they have? Ask about people from their past, examples, teachers, um, and personal history with a topic or dynamic. Ask people how their ideas and perspectives have shifted over time. Do you still think today the same that you did 10 years ago? If not, how has that changed? And then, as we've seen demonstrated in some of these vignettes, ask for feelings and what are the roots of where they come from. Ask for hopes as well as concerns, and ask people if they've ever thought about it from another perspective. This can be a tricky one, I got to tell you, because that can be used in a very negative way. But um, when I used to do divorce mediation, I would often ask parents to just take the perspective of their kids for a second and ask them what they're seeing from the perspective of their kids. So you can ask all these things that will help shift a conversation that feels stuck. I use the metaphor of the stream and standing in the stream with somebody. And the stream represents what they care about, their ideas, their beliefs, their passions, their perspectives. Um, and if you're stuck, you can explore the stream that they're in. Look down at the water. Explore what they care about. Ask them what they care about now and why it matters to them. And then go upstream. Look at the tributaries, the sources. Where did these passions and cares come from in the first place? Who influenced them along the way? And then look downstream with them to what would happen if their hopes are realized with this particular belief or perspective. What are their hopes? What do they see in the future, etc. And when you do this, it's interesting how often values come to the surface that you share. You discover that there are values there that you can link onto and start a different conversation that goes in a bit of a different direction. I'm going to wrap up by talking with you just a little bit about some of the insights from reflective structured dialogue, which is the method of dialogue that was created by the Public Conversations Project in 1989, has been used all over the world to help people in all different kinds of contexts deal with the toughest conflicts of our age. And there are certain things that we can use. This started in family therapy and was brought out to the world as some of the things that we're working with tough families. And now we're coming back to bringing some of these insights back into our lives, into our family lives. And the first is to lower the threat level, create a lower threat context through talking about a shared purpose for a conversation, inviting somebody to participate in a conversation, and then preparing yourself through a reflective process for getting ready to participate in a new way. The founder of Public Conversations, Dick Chasen, used to talk about helping people prepare themselves for a voyage into the new, which they may never have experienced before with the people that they're opposed to. And then think about how you can prevent those old patterns and stories from surfacing again and taking root by using communication agreements like we're not going to interrupt each other, we're going to let each other have the same amount of time, etc. And structures. I'll say more about structures in a minute. Promoting more complex and expansive stories of self and other through genuine curiosity, which I've talked about quite a bit in this time so far, and artful inquiry, which we just spent some time looking at. And then recover unstoried experience. And that goes back to that what's not broken. So many times when I used to see couples, they would come in and, as I said earlier, they would just only be able to think about what's broken. Every group, every relationship almost has some parts of it that have worked or that are working. And we want to weave that back into the story of that organization, the story of that family, the story of that relationship. So recovering that unstoried experience, what have you done well together before, is a real important part of transforming those dysfunctional patterns that reflective structured dialogue does, and that we can all use in our own family life. So just a little bit more about structured exchanges. What this means is using things like go rounds, taking turns, going, around the room. And it can just be two people. We're going to just take turns here. You're going to have a turn. I'm going to have a turn. We're not going to talk over each other. When you talk, I'm going to listen. When I talk, you're going to listen. And then timed responses. If you have a situation where people tend to run on and take over, have everybody speak within a certain time limit. And it democratizes the speaking. And it makes it easier for people actually to pay attention because they know they're not going to have to sit for a diatribe. If you're organizing a group meeting, moving from more structure to less structure, have things feel tightly controlled in the beginning and then loosen as you go through a single meeting or a series of meetings. As people get more used to, they internalize the sense of turn taking and equality of voice. You can let go of some of the structure. And then really important is the idea of pausing for reflection before an encounter, between people speaking, and even before people come into the room, giving people that opportunity to reflect. And that's sort of one of the components of Ruah, what I mentioned before. So that's bringing us to the end of our time together, at least the end of my presentation. We'll have some time to take some questions in a minute. And I want to end, well, I'm not going to totally end because I'm going to end with another poem, but I want to give you those questions again to be thinking about as you go forward into your challenging conversations, to think about what do you want to prevent coming up from within yourself and happening between you, and what do you want to promote instead. I want to thank my colleagues and friends who named themselves Dramatic Minds, who came together for the purpose of creating these vignettes. These are all real situations that one or more of us have struggled with. And they were really game to do this totally improv. And their names are here. Allison Baca, Tavi Mittal, Ray Rawls, Eric Schilge all played an active role. And then maybe the next time, Winnie Rugamba, John Saruf, and Haley Schneider will join us for an active presentation. But thank you so much to those folks who are willing to donate their time to do this. Let's wrap things up by a poem by Lucille Clifton called Blessing the Boats. We started with water. Let's end with water. Here it goes. May the tide that is entering, even now, the lip of our understanding, carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love your back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever. And may you, in your innocence, sail through this to that. Thank you so much for being with me through this presentation. And I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to Randy.
Bob, thank you so much. We are going to take a brief break, but I want to first very much say thank you for joining. Bob, if you need to go off camera, please go ahead. We're going to be taking a break for about 2 minutes. And while that is happening, I would encourage everyone, as you have stuck with us for the past more than an hour, please take a moment to reflect on what we've been learning, and also think about a question that you might like to enter in our Q&A within the within the Zoom Q&A function. So please go ahead and do that during this break time. Again, if you need to get up, stretch, do what you need to do. We'll be back with Bob in just a minute. Thank you. All right, we are back. Again, Bob, thank you for the very thoughtful presentation. And I have already seen some very thoughtful questions provided in our Q&A. Again, to all of our participants, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will be triaging them as best as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to get started. Again, my name is Randy Wilding, and I'm with Bob Staines for the Q&A portion of our Let's Talk series event. So very quickly, how has this technique played out in your family life? How have you applied it in your family life?
Oh man, let me count the ways. I'll start sort of at the beginning when I took the first workshop that Public Conversations Project offered many years ago, 1994. I was working in a different sort of field then. And was the first session of the first workshop. I came home that night, and my kids were 3 and 5 at the time. And my wife said, I came in the door and she said, "They're yours. They've been fighting for the last 2 hours." It was 9 o'clock. They should have been in bed by like 6:30 or 7. And she was beside herself. And I was stuck with these two arguing. And that's one thing I hated in terms of raising my children is when they argued. I really had a hard time. So I learned something that first night about turn taking and listening and agreements. So we sat at the bottom of the stairs, and I said, "Jake, you have 2 minutes to say what it is that's on your mind. And Becca, all you can do is listening. No arguing, no, talking back, no making faces, etc. You just listen for 2 minutes. And then when you're done, Jake, Becca, you have 2 minutes to speak. And same thing, Jake, you just listen." Bing, bing. They looked at each other, realized that they really didn't need to be fighting because they wanted the same thing. Problem solved. Took 5 minutes. And I said, "This is magic, man. I gotta learn more about this. I really want to know more about this." So that's one example of sort of just an individual interaction that's helped me in raise my children now are in their 30s, so it was a long time ago. But another example is when dealing with a family crisis. In my family, at one time, my stepmom had a heart attack, and she was in the hospital, and there was a discussion about whether to move her to a nursing home or leave her in the hospital. And in my family background, where I come from, people don't feel authorized to speak with medical staff. They have an attitude of they don't listen to us, they don't hear, but they don't have the people in the family don't feel like they can raise a question. So we did a modified dialogue on the unit where we had medical staff come together with my family to talk about what should be done with my mom. And the structure that I just laid out, turn taking, listening to each other, pausing between speaking, having a provocative question of what people's hopes were, enabled people to come into voice in the presence of others that they felt threatened by and speak their truth, to speak their sound of the genuine and to have it be heard. And as a result, everybody was able to agree on a treatment plan, and a process that had been dragging along for weeks was able to be reconciled and move forward within the space of an hour. So those are a couple of powerful examples. And then just in daily life, trying to remember to expand, even in talking with my wife. We both have our businesses in the house here, so we see each other a lot. And in those conversations, especially when I'm activated, to be able to open up, to ask better questions, to expand my view of her, and to bring more of myself into the conversation as well. So those are just a couple of examples.
Thank you so much, Bob. Okay, so what are the types of settings, in addition to your own home, that this technique or your approaches have proven useful?
So pretty much anywhere where people gather. My background, I would say if there's a thread that weaves itself through a lot of my work over the last 30 years, it's in communities of faith. I've done a lot of work in communities of faith, particularly ones that have been divided by a theological difference, or the minister has had an affair with somebody in the congregation, whatever it is, there's been a deep division. Schools are another place where division shows up. Civic organizations, other kinds of organizations where a political or moral or religious difference has started to divide people. Right now, I'm doing a lot of work with multinational corporations whose employees are grappling with the after effects of Israel-Gaza in terms of their relationship with the larger corporation and their relationship with each other and not knowing how to talk to each other, and those people that have different views. So really all kinds of contexts, as well as different countries and cultures from um, Africa and Liberia and Africa, talking about child soldiers returning to the towns where they held people, you know, terrorized people coming back from refugee camps, how that's going to be handled, uh, to working with multi-millionaire directors of a foundation board that are divided over politics and can't work together anymore because they can't speak to each other.
Wow. Um, thank you. That is quite a range. Okay, so very quickly, why do you use poetry in your presentations, and what about it speaks to you? How does it help when you're teaching others?
Wow, that's a fresh question that I've never had before. Thank you so much for that. Um, so the use of poetry and inviting people to think in terms of metaphor. A lot of times when I'm doing a dialogue, I'll have people bring an object that represents something to them about their core belief or someone that's been important to them in their life, um, because it takes people out of that cycle of being activated and that rational thinking and invites another kind of engagement, invites a different part of the mind and the soul and the spirit to be present in the room. And it sort of opens the possibility, if I start with a poem, it opens the possibility for people to be kind of poetic in their own thinking. At least that's my theory anyway. Same thing if I start out with a song or art, or I have people bring an object, I'm inviting people to use a different part of their brain to engage in the process of conversation. And often that's what we need. We need to sort of unhitch ourselves from the wagon of rationality to engage in a different way.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, I am going to go to, if you see me, my eyes bouncing around, I have a large screen and I am looking at both my Post-it notes that I wrote while you were talking and the questions that have come in since you began. Okay, so here we go. Have you used this with MAGA and not MAGA?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll say more
That's
about that.
good. Hey, you know what? Well, I guess I broke one of your rules, was I shouldn't have asked you a yes or no question.
Right.
But
Well, let me
fair
expound
enough.
on. In the after the 2016 election, I did a workshop. A colleague of mine, Sally Ann Roth, and I did a workshop on questions several days after the election. And most of the people who were coming to get trained had not voted for Donald Trump, and they could not. They didn't have a way of imagining speaking to their family members uh, about the family members who had voted for Donald Trump. They couldn't imagine a way of speaking. And they basically told us at lunchtime, this workshop is not going to work for us unless you give us something that we can go back home with. So, so we created something in the moment, and then I created the exercise at the end of this presentation about the stream, specifically for how to help people talk about to their relatives who voted differently from them, and they felt totally stuck. Um, and I've been using that now since 2016. I've been giving it to people, and people have been using it to talk about all kinds of things, including the election. So, yes, especially in this moment, these ways of being together are really, really important when talking about political differences because it's so fraught. And as soon as somebody starts to talk, everybody at the table at Thanksgiving or whatever starts to tense up because you don't know what's going to happen next. So if you use some of these skills of being able to express interest, get curious, draw people out, get to the story underneath the perspective, this can shift the conversation. I've used it in my own family. I have a whole branch of my two branches of my family actually, who are um, all people who voted for Donald Trump for different reasons. And when I go to those family gatherings, um, these skills have been really helpful to me because I didn't happen to vote for Donald Trump. And it's helpful for me to engage even in my own family. So, yeah.
Just to pull that thread a little bit longer with that topic, what has been the most helpful to you? Because I'm thinking from my experience, but also that other people who are listening to this and will listen to it, this presentation, would benefit from hearing what has really helped the situation when you're in that conversation specifically.
So before I answer that, I want to just say one thing. I want to make sure that people don't come away with the idea that this is a magic bullet, a cure-all that's going to work. It doesn't. You need to have people that are willing to engage in some way, and a lot of people are not. That's just the way it is. And you need to know, as Kenny Rogers says, when to hold and when to fold and when to walk away and when to run. So let's just put that up on the table. And I'm sorry, I lost your question in my own
No,
song.
I was
Say it again.
hearing the song in my head too. So so the question really was specifically with a heated political and extraordinarily divisive time. And specifically in the situation with your family, what has been the most effective technique, or what has maybe something that has really resonated with you in order to go up, make that voyage upstream or downstream?
Um, I have many relatives who served in the military and serve in the military, and one in particular who was in Vietnam um, and experienced pretty horrible things in Vietnam. And that person became a dedicated Republican and has voted since then for Republican candidates. Um, and to get to the place where he was willing to tell stories about his experience in Vietnam and how that affected his view of the government that sent him there, helped me to understand his passion for his particular political perspective. And the fact that I was interested in hearing those stories and willing to go there with him and stay there with him without trying to do anything correct or take care of or whatever, just to be present, to hear his sound of the genuine from that experience, created a bond between us. It didn't solve the political dilemma. We're still on very opposite sides of the coin, but there's a warmth that has grown because of that experience of telling his story and having his story be heard, and me understanding that, you know, I get where he's coming from in a way that I never did before, and that helps me see him as a more complex person and not just write him off as a caricature or a stereotype. And likewise, in terms of me being you know, Massachusetts liberal.
Understood. Thank you very much, Bob, for uh, helping me with that, giving us a little bit more context.
Sure.
Okay, so what is the best way to mitigate conversations that have gone awry?
Mm-hmm. So going back to the ruah, the part about reflection and stepping back and thinking for yourself about how has this conversation gone awry? What's my contribution? What are other people's contributions? Um, what purpose would I have in having a different conversation? And then seeing if you can invite somebody to have a conversation about a conversation. I'm thinking that I'd like to talk about where we've come from and how we wind up getting in these cycles together. Would you be open to having a conversation about that and how we could structure it differently so that we might engage each other in a different way? So that preparatory piece, that reflective piece, is really, really important to step back and think about the patterns, think about the ways that you've been activated, and invite the other person to do the same. And then to begin to construct something new with some of the ideas that I've given you tonight. Let's get together. Let's agree that we're not going to do the stuff we usually do. You know, when you say this, I say that, and that obviously upsets you, and then it gets us going. I'm going to try to hold back from saying that, and likewise, and talk about, you know, how could you create some basic agreements and ground rules that would lead to a different conversation. And I often will frame this. I'll encourage people to frame this as an exploration, that we're going to explore this together. We don't know if this is going to work, but let's try this together. If both of you are not happy with the way things are going, then there's some motivation to change, and some which opens the door to people's willingness to engage you in some way.
Thank you. We have a question that is similar to the MAGA question, but it has it's more specifically about someone saying something that is overtly racist, and someone responding to that. So my question is there any nuance that you would recommend above and beyond what you have already shared that relates to a political difference that might be specific to those discussions around, I'll extend it to identity. But the question is specifically mentioning someone says something overtly racist.
So it has to do with what your purpose is, the way you respond. If your purpose is to help that person think differently, calling out that remark is pretty well guaranteed to not have that effect. It will result in the person holding more tightly onto their perspective, and refusing to bend in the face of your teaching or whatever you're trying to do to help them to think differently. My colleague Ray Rawls, who was the person that was responding to the I'm not going to represent all Black women, talks a lot about this dynamic, and she is someone who goes into waters that I would not go into. She talks to KKK people, and has dialogues around the most severe race issues. And Ray says if you can find a way to get to the person's story that's underneath their perspective, without overtly condemning their perspective, you will get a lot further with that person than if you just name the response for what it is, or for what you perceive it to be. And that isn't just with race. This comes up all over the place with identity differences. I do a lot of work with sexual orientation in conservative religious settings, and somebody comes up with a very overtly homophobic remark when an LGBTQ person is present in the room. There's that dilemma of what to do. Do you call out the remark and label it for what it is, or do you have another way of engaging? I counsel another way of engaging if you can do it. We may not be able to do it. We may be so activated that it's impossible to do that. But if you can get to the level of story, there's a lot of good research about how people change. And they change through story, through having their stories elicited and hearing the stories of others. They don't change by sort of ideological confrontation. The Center for Belief at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, that's done some research on this, So that's why this approach is really oriented around seeing if we can get below that and the story that's underneath that. I recently had a situation where somebody said something in a group. It was a racial remark, and the other person responded, what experience leads you to that perspective? What personal experience have you had that leads you to that perspective? And it started a conversation that went off in a completely unpredictable and much more useful way than it would have if that person had just said, this is a racist remark. And I know that's, very difficult to do because we feel hurt. We feel because we have been hurt. I don't want to minimize that. But I also want to say that, sort of calling out has been pretty ineffective in terms of how to engage that. So if there's a way to explore, hard as it may be, with that person, what the story is, that's a way to get past that. But again, it's one of those situations where you have to decide, are you willing to put yourself through it, hearing it? Is it going to be too painful for you to do that? And if so, you may need to walk away from that conversation, because that's the other option, is to step away. I don't know. I feel like I'm now kind of running off, so you better rein me in.
Well, I think it's all applicable. And so I guess a follow-up question would be, sometimes you have to admit in any of these situations that you have to admit you are not ready to receive feedback, or you're not ready to be curious. Do we lose something by not do you think we lose something by allowing ourselves the additional time to say, can we talk about this later, versus dealing with it head on?
Yeah. So if I'm working with people, say in a dialogue group, I'm also giving them a lot of tools for self-management, ways that they can take care of themselves and make those decisions. Do I need to take a break from this right now? Am I willing to take a break and come back to it? Is the other person willing to take a break and come back to it? And then there are a lot of things that people can do to take care of themselves on that break. But yeah, to just basically say, I can't talk about this right now. I'd like to talk about this, if that's the truth, but I can't right now. Can we return to this later under different circumstances? And sometimes the answer is going to be, yeah, I want to engage this. And sometimes the answer is going to be no. But I'm glad that you bring that up, because that certainly is an option to step back, take a break. And in a group conversation, I do this all the time in the dialogues where things get heated and people need to take a break. They need to step aside. They need to do some self-care routines. I may need to work with them to help them return, and then they can return because they've done that work of care. And in this approach, so if we're doing group work, reflective structured dialogue work, there are two things that we keep in mind. One is self-regulation of emotion. So we're creating situations where people are more able to take care of themselves because of the structures and the processes. And then there's co-regulation of emotion. So we help people take care of each other, and we help people lean on the structure and process to be sort of a container and a holder that will help people manage themselves, sort of be their companion in managing themselves when things get hot.
Thank you. And as an aside, I've been very fortunate to be the recipient, and albeit during COVID, trained on the reflective structured dialogue technique. In my experience with Howard County Courageous Conversations, as a person not of a specific faith group, I walked into a situation where they needed people to help with facilitation. And this was through Essential Partners, this was the technique, the communication guidelines, the agreements, the very very thoughtful process that just the questions went through, and also time for self-regulation and co-regulation. It is, to a person who has only experienced reaction, who has only experienced yelling, it is revolutionary, because it enables people. This is a commercial, but we're listening. We're listening to the reason why this is so important. It just gives people a moment to breathe and to think. And when you're in that reactionary mindset, when you're, at the fight or flight, or freeze, that this is one way to avoid those polar opposites. You can take a breath and think and reflect. And so I'm going to go back to the questions.
Before you do, let me throw one more point in, if that's
Sure,
okay.
please.
So one of the things I, didn't mention in this talk, which may be of interest to folks, is the discipline of internal family systems therapy. It's a form of family therapy, and it talks about how we have sort of parts of ourselves that can be sort of hurt and activated, sort of wounded parts from the past. And when those parts are wounded in some way by what somebody says, we can be hijacked by emotion. We can feel like we have no choice. Remember that predator and prey image?
Yes.
We can feel, and people will say, well, she made me say that. She made me feel that. Well, no, but that's how it feels. It feels like you're being forced. It feels because you're being hijacked. So another function of this sort of stepping away and taking a break is to be able to reflect and say, well, what part of me was hurt in that situation? And can I let go of this particular feeling that feels like a freight train that's running through me right now? And we're creating ways for people to do that, to unhitch from that hijacking.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, really quick. Some of these questions I really feel like we have answered. I'm going to ask this one again. I'm going to ask this one because I think I might get a different or another perspective. How do you see specifically these techniques playing out in our present political situation?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I'm seeing it. I don't have a vision of it on large scale at this point. There was a time, many, many years ago when I did some work with members of Congress, and there was an openness to that kind of thing. And I think that time is gone, at least from what I can see from the outside. I'm not on the inside. But I do think there are opportunities at the grassroots level to change the ways we engage people in the local things that we're involved in. So if we're serving on city councils, if we're serving in any capacity, in group capacity, in community life, we can start to change the ways that we engage each other. And Laura Chasen, the founder of Public Conversations, often got the question of, well, how do you create critical mass so that this is scalable and et cetera, et cetera. And she said, we're a small group. We don't have the capacity to create critical mass. But what we do have the capacity to do is to create critical yeast. So that if we can affect, and there's actually been some measurement on this in the intervening years, if we affect one person by helping them change the way they engage, that person is going to affect somewhere between 25 and 50 people with the ways that they engage. And we hear all the time people come to a training or they participate in a dialogue. And somebody actually said this. I just did a training in Fort Wayne, Indiana last month, a dialogue training. And after the first day, one of the participants came in and said, I've been wanting to talk to my girlfriend for a long time. about this particular issue. And I talked to her last night for the first time, and we were able to have the most meaningful conversation we ever had, because I use these techniques. So on a small scale, in our individual relationships and our group relationships, I think we can make a difference that does start to percolate through the society. But in terms of engaging the larger forces, I think we have to keep on keeping on and keep focusing on creating opportunities for people to voice the sound of the genuine and hear the sound of the genuine, as Howard Thurman did. Your listeners may or may not know that Howard Thurman was Martin Luther King Jr.'s mentor at the BU School of Theology. And a lot of King's ideas came from the teaching of Thurman about how to engage and change people. So, I see a lot of promise in that and the ways that we engage. I'm not sort of a big thinking systems guy. There are other organizations that do that much better. And they could probably give you a different answer. But I do think that if we can change the ways that relate in all the contexts that we find ourselves in group work, it does percolate out into the larger society.
Thank you very much, Bob. Okay. This is a little bit long. I'm going to read it in full. In quote unquote, the subjugation of women, J.S. Mill posits that some topics are difficult to discuss because one person's understanding, not Mill's, is based on feelings. Feelings are deep and not readily available in conversation, Mill says. Is it possible that when I'm focused on my own feelings, that a conversation quickly seems to me to be an ad hominem attack?
Sorry, but it's been a while since I've been to college. Explain to me what an ad hominem attack is, because I don't know.
Well, it's been a while since I've been to college, Bob. But I am going to say that it feels like a kind of roundabout way. If I were to try and use the contextual clues, a roundabout way of getting to someone or to the feeling of being attacked.
Maybe the questioner could give you some clarification in the chat of what that question means, because I'm not exactly sure how to.
Okay. You know what? I'm looking at the chat, and I'm also going to go to another question, then we can come back to it. Sometimes it feels wrong to choose decorum in what feels like a life or death situation or conversations. Genocide, violence against minorities, those conversations feel urgent, and it sort of feels wrong to have a peaceful conversation. Where's the line where we use the tools in this class versus being more adamant? Question mark.
Sure. Well, you'll have to determine what that line is for yourself, number one. Number two, I'm not saying there shouldn't be a line. I'm saying there should be a line. There's a time to light the torches and march the streets. There's a time to agitate and use other techniques to effect change. I do them myself. So like I said, dialogue is not a panacea. It's not the be-all and end-all. Engaging in this way is not necessarily the only way. There are times when we have to fight for what's right and what we believe. That being said, I also think that we have to, what we don't want to do is what my colleague Corky Becker used to call accepting the reciprocal. And that is, we don't want to put on the same behavior that our oppressors are using, or who we perceive to be our oppressors, and simply mimic the opposite. And I've done this work so long that I see this happening so often, that people on one side will mimic the negative behaviors of people on the other side, even though they stand for something much better. And in that, they just perpetuate the way things are going. So with that caution, I do think that there are times when we do not necessarily want to engage in dialogue. I'll give a quick example. back in the times when the sexual abuse scandal was being uncovered in the Catholic Church and started in the Boston area, we were invited, a Public Conversations Project, to off the record host dialogues between victims and priests. Not necessarily the priest that perpetuated, but at that time we felt, no, this is not a place for dialogue right now in this particular time, in this particular context, with these particular people. And so we refuse. So there are times when even when I'm helping a planning group, for instance, decide, is the situation ripe for dialogue? A lot of times it's not. Other things need to happen, or other actions need to be taken. So thanks for the question. I think I probably said enough about that.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you for our participant for providing the definition of ad hominem. Ad hominem as a direct attack on me as a person, not as the participant in the conversation. So going to the core, my heart, my essence versus a participant in the conversation.
So again, if you could go back to that,
Sure.
the prelude to that question that led up to that ad hominem statement.
Feelings are deep and not readily available to conversation. Mill says, is it possible that when I am focused on my own feelings, that a conversation quickly seems to me to be an ad hominem attack?
So first, that statement is based on a premise that conversations are not readily available, feelings are not readily available in conversations. I would say that given the right context, that is an utterly false premise. Feelings, I go back to a quote from Parker Palmer, who talks about inviting the soul into conversation. And he said the soul is like a shy animal who feels like it would rather stay in the woods, and it needs to be invited out into conditions of safety. Same way with, I think, feelings. For many people, if the conditions are right, the feelings will come, and they'll be expressed in a way that can be heard by other people. So I think that absent that, there is a tendency sometimes when one person expresses a feeling, the other person can feel personally attacked by that. And you have the opportunity in conversation to explore that. Where does that feeling come from? What assumptions is it based on? And to get underneath that feeling into the story that gives birth to that feeling. And when you can do that, obviously, I feel that you can make a significant difference. I hope that sort of responds to the questioner.
I believe it does, but we will find out. Okay. Depolarization and dialogue can be tricky during a protest march. De-escalation is taught in real time. In thinking how to put together a de-escalation training, de-escalation street teams, which parts of your presentation are more helpful techniques, parenthesis skills, to use for training street group scenarios? I was thinking de-escalation and intentionality.
I'm not familiar with the de-escalation training that's done, so I can't speak to that. What I can speak to, and this may or may not be relevant, is that when I started my career in mental health as a therapist, I started on the streets. I started as an outreach worker, early intervention, prevention, psychiatric outreach. And one of the things that I needed to do was, if the mayor of Gloucester called me up and said, George is standing in the middle of Main Street screaming at people and hallucinating and threatening to punch people out, I had to go into the middle of Main Street and stand with George and figure out how to invite him to calm down enough to come over to the side and have a cup of coffee. That was obviously formative to me in terms of how I think about the work today. And so, again, I'm not familiar with the de-escalation training that's done in the streets. I certainly am very familiar with protest marches from going back all the way into the 60s and protesting, against racism and the war. But I would say that in terms of one of the things we think about when we think about polarization is who benefits from keeping people polarized. And I think that actors on the right and the left have a great investment in keeping people polarized and demonizing the other. And so what I want to do is create the situation where we can take that demonization out of the picture. I mean, on the street is not probably the best place to do that because you're already there, sort of representing one side or the other. But I think that that question of who's benefiting from this, and I've certainly been in many progressive circles where there's a great investment in portraying those people as evil. And progressive, I say, because that's the kind of crowd that I tend to run with. And it just is not, it's not useful for longer term change. Recently, I went to a great presentation by two guys from an organization on the West Bank called Roots. It's a dialogue group that was formed about 10 years ago by one of the members of the original Intifada and a rabbi from one of the settlements who had been there for 38 years and never met an actual Palestinian. 10 years ago, they came together and formed this group called Roots. They spoke at Brandeis University a few weeks ago. And Khalid, the Palestinian representative, said, what we discovered and what we know is that peace does not come by men sitting in a room and signing their names to a piece of paper. Peace will only come by changed relationships. So we've dedicated our lives and ourselves to changing the relationships between us, Jew and Palestinian, because we believe that that's how real peace will come. If anybody had reason to want to write off the other side, it was this guy. And yet he was talking about the importance of cultivating a relationship.
So what I would love to, and you tell me if you don't want to do this, but I would love to know, in an ideal world, or you know what, not an ideal world. How about this world? What would you suggest, taking into account all of the information that you've shared, and specifically around the changed relationship between the opposites, or the perceived opposites? I keep hearing, and we also echo, depolarization. And that may be true. But if just for a moment, if we just say you and me, or we, and people who feel on the left or the right, they feel that they can only exist in a left or right world, what could we do as I'll say as much as an organization, but also as a country, to help depolarize and to change the relationship around where we are today, in order to make things less about us versus them?
That's a huge question. I have a couple of ways of thinking about that. One is, I think, something that I see across the board, and I've seen it for decades now. I see it in my personal life, I see it in professional life and political life, is if people can let go of their commitment to certainty about the other. That is step number one. Are you willing to let go of your certainty about who they are? And if you're willing to do that, then ask a question. I can't tell you how many gatherings I go to where nobody asks questions of each other, anything useful. Just me as a person. I go home, I go back to Buffalo. I'm there for 3 days with my family and friends. Not a single person will ask me a single question that has anything to do with what really matters to me. Well, if we could just start doing that, especially with people that we have profound disagreements with. It would start to change relationships. Um, and uh, I wrote down something that I wanted to say, and I can't read my own writing. So
It happens to the best of us, Bob.
another point there, but I've lost it. But that willingness to ask, that willingness to be genuinely curious and interested, um, is really at the core of a relationship change, conversation change, and getting things on a different path. People will be surprised, and they'll be um, touched that you're interested in them. Quickie, we have a couple minutes. I'll give an example of this. My colleague John Struth and I were doing a focus group actually with a group of gun owners in rural Massachusetts, very, very, very far to the right, very much Second Amendment. We were doing a focus group with them and a focus group with people on the other side. And at the beginning of this focus group, we asked them, would you be interested in talking with the other side? And to a person, they said, no way, we're not getting involved with those liberal people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all the stereotypes kind of were trotted out. We asked them the same question at the end of the focus group, which was a 2-hour meeting. And they said, when can we start? Can you bring people here next week for a conversation? And I'm like, what? You started out saying there was no way in hell that you were going to be willing to talk to these people. What changed? And they said, you asked us questions that enabled us to show up as more than just caricatures that people make of us. And if this is the kind of conversation that we're going to have, if this is the way that we're going to be invited to talk so we can show up as full people, we're interested in that. We want to be seen in that way. We're tired of being called baby killers, et cetera, et cetera. And we're willing to give up a little bit of our own prejudice in order to do that. And I find that to be the case, that when people have that opportunity, they want to take it.
Well, we've got 2 more minutes. I just want to give you the opportunity for those that are, whether or not they're still on live, but also for the people who join us after the fact, when this recording is on YouTube and on our website. If there's any, I mean, you gave us beautiful words. You gave us poetry, techniques that we can actually use tomorrow, maybe after a little bit of internalization, but you gave us tools that we could use. So thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to share to our audience?
I guess the sort of, you have those multi-tools that are all embedded in one that, and I would say that the multi-tool that I recommend to people is just one key question. Can you tell me about an experience you've had that's related to what you're talking about right now? If you don't come away with anything else, if you come away with that question to pose to people when things are getting hot or when you're deeply disagreeing and you don't know what to do, that will serve you well. Amen.
Thank you so much, Bob. I believe Paul's gonna come back on and say good night to everyone. But on behalf of the Doxy Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation, I thank you for your time, your expertise, your heart, and for your continued faith in humanity. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure listening and also getting an opportunity to talk to you. Thank you very much. Paul, you're welcome to close us out.
Yeah. I want to thank you, Bob, for the evening. There's a lot to think about. One of the things is what I think is important is for people to reflect on what they want. And I think you started out by talking about how important reflection was. So I thank you for that. I thank you for making the time to speak to the group. And I want to thank Randy and Stephanie for all the background work in filtering the questions. And again, I thank you, and peace to you and your family.
And peace to you.
And to the audience, thank you for attending. And remember that we live by donations. So keep us in mind. and good evening.
Take care.